Both informative and insightful as we share with you some emerging ideas from our upcoming book, Reinventing Jobs, as well as some research that we at Willis Towers Watson have done around the future of work and the rapid proliferation of digitalization and its transformative effect on organizations. I want to start with a bit of a quote from our book. This is actually on the front inside cover of our book. And it reflects, I think, the changing dynamic for many of our organizations where what used to be that primary source of a competitive advantage, our legacy, whether it was our infrastructure, our technology, our customer relationships, the capabilities of our leaders, the programs that developed and filled those pipelines of leaders. Increasingly, we're finding, and John and I saw this in spades in the many different companies we profiled in our book, that increasingly this legacy is also the primary obstacle to sustainable automation and the reinvention of work. And so the work we've been doing with many organizations and that we'll talk about is how do you build on this legacy and try to use it both as a strength as it used to be, but also ensure that the impediments it puts up to your transformation can be dealt with. One of the things that is obviously, as we all know from both our personal and professional lives, what is at the heart of this transformation is not just the rapid evolution of new technologies, many of which build on each other and act as accelerants, but also, as you can see from this slide, the rapid rate of adoption of those technologies. So whether it was from the mainframe, which, where it took us an extended period of time to get to 10 million versus the pace with which the Internet of Things has rapidly grown over the course of the last 10 years or so. That pace of adoption is causing work in organizations to change pretty dramatically. I know it's fairly early in the day for some of you for a history lesson, but I always find this slide to be useful, and it's a piece of work that we did coming out of one of our projects with the World Economic Forum, where we looked at the impact of digital media on society and organizations. And essentially what you see is this construct of a job and the way in which we organize work and the way in which we organize our organizations is about 150 years old, going back to the Second Industrial Revolution. And it not only is it reflective in how we work and how we organize, but also how we think about our careers and our rewards as well. And the whole premise was about increasing the efficiency of work by having it done within the walls of the organization. You fast forward to the Third Industrial Revolution, or the first machine age, as Andrew McAfee would call it, and what you see is the democratization of information, our ability to look outside the walls of the organization and understand the cost, the quality, and risks of work being done beyond that organizational boundary. And that really was the start of what we now know to be outsourcing, as companies lifted and shifted entire processes either to another geography or to another entity that could do the work more efficiently and in some cases do it better. The average savings from outsourcing, as many of us will know, was about 25 to 30%. We then get to the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the Uberization of work, if you will, where we're seeing the rapid deconstruction of jobs and the proliferation of automation in various shapes and forms, and we'll touch on those different types of automation in a second. But what we're seeing is the rise of organizations as platforms where work is distributed to multiple different entities and then reconstructed within the walls of the organization. It has tremendous and dramatic implications for many of the things that those of us on the phone get involved with, thinking about how we reward talent, how we manage culture, how we manage the deployment of work, and it's raising both opportunities and challenges. The thing that really caught John's and my attention, and the reason we wrote this book with Harvard Business Press, is the changing economics of work. So I mentioned the 25 to 30% savings and associated improvements in speed and throughput that came with outsourcing. As we looked at the deconstruction and democratization of work, some of the analysis that we've done for organizations indicates savings of closer to 60 to 80%. So orders of magnitude greater than outsourcing, improvements in speed to capability of 3 to 5x, and improvements in productivity of about 4 to 6 times. So a fundamental change in the economics of how we run our businesses. What I'd like to do is share with you some of the findings from our research, and between John and I, we'll tag team some of this because I think it sheds some interesting insight into how this fourth industrial revolution is really playing out. This survey was done at the end of last year, early this year, and it's global in nature. We got responses from over 900 companies around the world, and covering virtually organizations of virtually every size and every industry. And some of the findings were really interesting, and as a result, it really busted, in our minds, a lot of the myths that we see out there in terms of work and how work is being done and how it's being deployed. So one of the first myths is, as we see organizations moving to this new plurality of means for getting work, the rapid rise of the use of contingent labor, and the myth that all contingent labor is disengaged and perhaps not as committed to your organization's success. And this was one of the early myths that was busted, where as we talked to both employers as well as contingent talent, that they are just as likely to be as motivated to support your business model, your purpose for the organization, as are your full-time employees. And John and I will share with you some of the specific findings from various pieces of research that align to this particular myth. John?
So it kind of coincidentally, as Ravin and his team, or a little bit before Ravin and his team did this survey, my colleague Wayne Cassio and I were doing kind of a broad literature review and research review of what's been studied about workers in under different arrangements. And one of the things we found was that there hasn't been a lot of study of most of the different arrangements, perhaps not surprisingly, since research tends to lag practice and you have to wait until people are doing it before you can study it. What we found was that almost all the research is comparing contract workers of some type or other to full-time workers. And those studies primarily were designed to look at whether the contract workers were less engaged, felt alienated, et cetera. I think it's fair to say that the going-in idea of those studies was that the researchers wanted to prove the idea that contingent workers feel kind of left out, less committed, wish they were full-time, et cetera. And this is going back probably into the 70s. What's interesting, there's certainly a number of findings where you can find a situation where that's true, but what was interesting to me was the number of findings where the situation turned out to be different and where in fact the contractors or contingent workers reported equal or greater engagement. And when you begin to look at what causes that, so Ravin will have some statistics on what leaders believe in terms of contingent workers. What the research suggests is that it can go either way. It's certainly not unusual for contractors and others to feel less engaged, to feel like outsiders, et cetera. When they feel more engaged, they usually also report these kinds of conditions. One is volition, that they chose the work arrangement freely and weren't forced into it. A second one, kind of the next two are very related, emotional support from coworkers and supervisors. And interestingly, that support can come from the contracting organization, the one that you contract with to hire them, or the organization where they actually work. And so both the organization where they work and the organization that placed them can contribute to this idea of emotional support. That's closely related to the idea that they feel a psychological connection to the organization they work with, not just an arm's length economic one. And then finally, continuity, the idea that they feel this relationship could continue. Often that's in the shape of opportunities to transition to longer term employment. What's interesting to me, and we'll see more data on this, is that if you look at this list of factors, that can cause contingent workers to be as or more engaged than regular workers, they often also kind of fly in the face of what a lot of general counsels will tell you is a dangerous co-employment problem. And if you actually create situations where people can be engaged like this, there is a certain amount of regulatory pressure to say, well, now you're treating them just like employees. So I don't know that anybody has the answer to that yet, but it is kind of interesting to see that the research suggests that the way to get contingent workers engaged may also be a way that needs to be done carefully, or that needs to be done with transparency in terms of regulatory agencies, general counsels, et cetera. So Ravin, perhaps you'll continue and show us some of the research from leaders about what they believe.
Thanks, John. And so what you can see on this slide, to John's point, is some of the feedback that we heard from the leaders who took our survey as to the commitment of different pools of talent to their organizational success. And what you can see is, in fact, appropriately engaged, to John's point on the previous slide, you're going to find that these different pools of talent who may engage with you differentially, whether they're part-time reduced hours, workers on loan from other organizations, sometimes vendors and partners, free agent talent, independent contractors, or talent on online marketplaces like Upwork, that they're just as likely to put in the extra effort as full-time employees, provided you address some of the challenges and the opportunities that John talked about on the previous slide. What is interesting, to John's very point about how organizations are going about this, and this was one of the more intriguing findings from this particular piece of research, is we're hearing from more and more organizations that they want to shift from just having an employee value proposition to a broader talent value proposition, where they think about engaging this broad swath of talent that is the means with which their business models are executed. And what we're seeing is organizations pushing the boundaries and maybe challenging what they may be hearing from legal and general counsels as to how best to engage this talent. And you can see some of the programs and processes that organizations are putting in place today, things like learning and developmental opportunities, access to wellness programs, access to benefits, in contrast to paying for benefits, which, as many of us will know, is a pretty bright red line and tends to attract all the attention we don't want. Recognition programs, performance coaching, and pretty significant increases in all of those programs expected over the course of the next 3 years as more and more organizations turn to non-employee talent as part of their overall pool of labor in executing their business models. John, did you want to talk about some of the other findings from the piece of work that you and Ed have done? John, you may be on mute.
Thanks, Ravin. Sorry. So from Ravin's survey, you're starting to get some information that may provide some good benchmarking. We're beginning to see a pattern here about some of the choices you'll need to make as these trends continue, and particularly in those areas of work where you're going to find that staying agile, addressing future trends is going to require different work arrangements. Now, this slide is hard to read. We'll fix it before we send it out to you. I'll tell you what each of the bars means. The stems you see on the left are the beginning phrases of some questions that Ed and I asked in our survey, which was conducted in about 2016 and has just been published by Stanford University Press, Achieving HR Excellence. So you can go to Stanford University Press, or you can go to the Center for Effective Organizations website, and you can find out more about our writing from those results and also how to get the book. Here we were asking about, and you'll see the framework in just a moment that Ravin and I used in Lead the Work. We tried to put some questions from Lead the Work into our survey. So top to bottom, what we're looking at is the proportion of companies that say more than 20%, 25% of their work is the following. The first bar is designed to combine human workers and automation. rather than replacing humans with automation. And as you can see, if you look there at the bottom, somewhere between 15 and 20% of organizations said they were doing this when we did our survey in 2016. Now, this pattern will hold up, so I'll just talk about it here. We've done some additional surveys, primarily in my work with I4CP and Kelly Services, where we had samples of populations of leaders who were coming to a session that I was leading. And we asked them as well, and those surveys took place in 2017 and 18. And for example, rather than the 15 to 20% that you see here, those surveys suggested in the first bar it was closer to 27%. So it would be far to the right of what we see here. That's kind of true all the way down the line, that we're seeing, as we did these later surveys, we saw a rather significant increase in all of these kinds of things, the proportion of companies where a quarter of their work reflects these. So going down the line then, explicitly, the second one is explicitly being analyzed for possible automation. So first one is designed to combine humans and automation. The second one is we're analyzing our role in a way that would let us combine automation and humans. The third one, we'll talk more about automation in a minute. The third one was rewarded in ways other than traditional rewards like money, benefits, et cetera. And as you can see, that's pretty high. In the I4CP sample survey we did, that is closer to 40%. So here it's almost 25. And as of 2017 and 18, we're seeing these new reward approaches really take off. The next one below, still related to rewards, rewarded immediately, or rewarded, excuse me, in an individualized way versus just some blanket way. And again, same kind of thing. We see about 10% here, a little bit more in I4CP, rewarded immediately upon task completion rather than waiting for some kind of yearly performance review or something like that. And then carried out through collaborations and connections that cross organization boundaries. So we do the reward through alliances, through borrowing and loaning talent from other organizations. And again, we saw that at about 26% in the I4CP survey back in 2016 at a little less than 15. Work that's attached from a traditional employment relationship is third from the bottom. Again, that shows up at about 7% here. It's already 20% in the I4CP study that we did with the same questions. Location and time flexible, you can see the number there. Again, that's closer to 20 in the 2018 data. And then design as projects and tasks versus traditional job roles. Again, back in 2016, our sample of a fairly broader sample probably than the I4CP one, I would say more encompassing of traditional organizations. We saw a little less than 5. The I4CP study saw close to 30 in terms of designing things as projects, tasks, et cetera. So as I said, you can see more on this in the book that Ed and I wrote, but I would also give you some perspective that these lines seem to be moving pretty drastically to the right as we go through time. If we move to the next slide, Ravin, I'll just do that one and just start and then turn it back to you. Here we see the framework that was a part of the book called Lead the Work. And in our session in October, which this webinar is designed to bring your attention to, we'll actually go much, much deeper into some of the trends that are defining the work this way. And what we did was we proposed this framework, number one, as a way to see the examples and understand what's going on, but number two, as a diagnostic that organizations could use to say where might we improve or enhance our agility, enhance our ability to get things done. So the top dimension is the assignment. We might call it the work, but we needed a different word. So on the left, you have tradition. It's in jobs. It's collected in one organization. It's part of an employment relationship. On the right in that top line, you have it designed as tasks. It's dispersed to a wide array of workers that may exist in many different places, and it's in more of a market relationship than a strict employment relationship. Same thing in the second dimension. The left side, more traditional. The organization is a self-contained boundary. It's detached from the outside. It's insular. There's kind of rigid requirements. And then on the right-hand side, an organization that is more permeable, that interlinks with outside institutions like contractor organizations or pools of volunteers or alliances with others, and so that the boundary becomes more malleable. And then finally, the rewards. Traditional on the bottom at the left, permanent relationship or one that's expected to be for the lifetime of employment, more collective, and consistent. We try to have the same reward system for everybody, and generally drawing on traditional things like pay, benefits, hours, et cetera. On the right-hand side, a more impermanent relationship, much more individualized and differentiated, and then imaginative rewards to things like sense of purpose, to badges, that kind of thing. So again, the offer here would be for you to think about in your own organization, how does the heat map of the work that you have play against this, and where would you dial these dials to create innovative ways to engage workers that may not be all dialed all the way to the left and may not also be all dialed all the way to the right. And in the prior graph that I showed you, you saw some of what Ed and I found in terms of how far this is being developed in organizations. Ravin?
Great, thanks, John. So we're going to shift from talking about these different sources of talent to getting into the automation and its implications. But I wonder if there are any questions. And Gina, don't know if you want to, if anyone has pinged you with questions, or if we want to open up the lines.
We have nothing so far in the chat box, but feel free to send a question if you have one. Make sure that you mark send to everyone so that we can all see the question. But so far, nothing yet, and I don't see any hands raised. Okay, great. We will continue on then. So the other myth that we hear about, and we see this every day in the popular press, is that workplace automation is going to have a negative impact on workers and jobs. And what we found is that the impact is actually far more nuanced, and that it's really going to drive some fundamentally different combinations of work, talent, skill requirements, and work relationships. So what you'll see on this next slide is, as we looked at the sample, both the purple bars are for the data in the U.S. and those lovely teal-colored bars are for the data globally. And so while there is the expectation that organizations will continue to reduce their reliance on full-time employees, they also anticipate using more non-FTE talent. So you'll see a decline between now and the next 3 years of FTEs, but an expected increase, a modest one at that, in part-time, reduced part-time talent, an increase in free agent workers, consultants and outside agencies. And while the numbers are still small, we expect to see pretty significant increases in the use of talent on loan from other organizations or free agents on online marketplaces like Tongle and Topcoder and Upwork that we wrote about in Lead the Work. So a much more diverse mix of work sources. The other question that was particularly interesting was we asked organizations about, as they start to apply automation to work and not just deploy the resulting work or the remaining work to these other work options, what do they expect the impact to be? Certainly, we're seeing companies being required to pay more for talent with certain skill sets as we look at the convergence of multiple industries digitalizing and all chasing the same profile of digital talent, whether it's developers, data scientists, et cetera. But the other thing that was particularly intriguing was the question as to, as a result of automation, do you expect skill premiums to increase or decrease? And the response was yes. And I think it really captures the essence of how automation is transforming many of our organizations, because we certainly see many examples of where skill premiums are in fact increasing. And as work is increasingly automated, the example that we often encounter, and is something in our book, is in many call centers, as more and more automation takes on in terms of the use of natural language processing and AI, the skill premiums required of the call center representatives have actually increased as they are now required as the routine administrative work or the routine transactions are handled by a chatbot, and it's the more challenging interactions that come to the human being. And so the skill premiums, the ability to demonstrate empathy, a premium on emotional intelligence,
all of those skills now become much more prominent. So an example of where the skill premiums are increasing. And yet in other instances, we see companies redesigning work and jobs to lower the skill premiums. We're seeing this in many manufacturing settings, particularly in the Midwest, where there is, in fact, a shortage of manufacturing talent as a result of a number of factors, and organizations wanting to reduce their reliance on that skilled talent through the application of robotics and the use of talent that maybe is not quite as skilled that can work alongside some of those new robots. So a much more nuanced and rapidly changing landscape for work. One of the so the other myth that was that relates to the one we just talked about is how organizations are using automation, and there has certainly been much of that's been said about the use of automation to reduce cost and minimize errors and substitute human labor. But the philosophy and perspective of the 900-odd companies that we talk to is that they actually see essentially a second wave of automation where the focus is increasingly on the augmentation of human performance and increasing human productivity. And what you see on this next slide is how we think about automation, and this is the focus, one of the early elements of the book that John and I wrote, Reinventing Jobs, is we looked at 3 types of automation that are redefining work in organizations today. I think many of you will be familiar with these 3 types. So robotic process automation, essentially process automation for white-collar work. It's the types of tasks that it takes on, a high routine, high-volume, independent, often analytical work that involves the integration of multiple data sets. There is great maturity here with lots and lots of vendors and providers in the space. And the impact is we would rate as medium because it really is more of an efficiency and a cost play. Where there is probably the most excitement is around cognitive automation or artificial intelligence, where the combination of technologies like machine learning, natural language processing, are truly transforming work that is non-routine, that is cognitive in nature. And the expected impact over the long term is expected to be high. And then the last dimension of automation is what we think of as social robotics. So a shift from the traditional robots of the 50s and 60s, which were largely homogeneous, often singular in both what they did and how they did it, to increasingly a new breed of robots which combine the equipment with sensors, intelligence, and mobility. So the robot is able to actually engage with other robots and with human beings. Autonomous vehicles would be but one example, and there are many, many others that many other examples of social robotics. But it's these 3 forms of automation that we view as being essential to the future of work, and there obviously are many subsets. So with that definition, what we asked the participants in our survey was, how do they expect automation to expand over the course of the next 3 years? And what has it looked like in the previous 3? And what you'll see, unsurprisingly, is a pretty dramatic expected increase from where we were 3 years ago, where globally about 93% of all work was being done by humans, to potentially, within the next 3 years, just 78%. And the 2 columns to the right of those bar charts, the first one to the right is the percentage of organizations where 100% of work was, is, or will be done by humans. And so think of your small professional services firms, many of your small and medium enterprises. And that number is expected to decline precipitously in terms of where 100% of the work will continue to be done by humans. And then the third column is where we've excluded those companies where 100% of the work is being done by humans. So all in all, a pretty dramatic shift from where we've been for the last 3 years. To my earlier point about the role of automation, with this, what is increasingly being called a second wave of automation, it feels like there has been a shift in philosophy as it relates to how organizations are thinking about automation, expecting it to play a much more transformative role, more as a driver of augmenting human capability and creating demand for new types of skills, versus the traditional model of where it was perhaps mostly focused on cost reduction and labor substitution. And you can see that both for the U.S. and for the global sample here on this particular slide. Before John talks about the framework that we developed to help organizations think about how to optimize the combination of humans and automation, it looks like we might have a question or two, Gina.
Yeah, just starting from the top, if you scroll to the top of the chat box, Ravin, we have a couple of different questions coming in. Michael House has a question on slide 14. What are some of the examples that companies are rewarding in other ways than ... So going back to slide 14, some examples of some of those companies.
Yeah, John, did you want to take that? John, you may be on mute. Oh, no. I wonder if we've John, are you still there?
I'll go ahead and check and see if he's still with us. But if you want to go ahead and take some of the other questions beneath that, there's another question there from Manohar.
So workplace automation, the second question here is, workplace automation seems attractive in theory, especially in light of the savings mentioned, yet moving towards automation seems like a massive overhaul project. What are some practical first steps to start moving towards automation? That's a great point. The work we've done with organizations for the last, I would say, 3 years or so, has really emphasized a much more agile, design-centric, design thinking approach to the application of automation. So certainly there are opportunities to sort of for widespread enterprise-wide adoption. But where we've seen automation be used successfully is where we've started with a particular workflow or a particular process to be able to prototype and pilot very quickly, to look at the impact of automation on the particular work of humans, to understand exactly what is being substituted versus augmented versus where new human work is created. In fact, the framework that we'll talk about in a second is the approach that we believe to be most optimal in understanding what the body of work is, what the nature of the problem is you're trying to solve, and what the role of automation is in addressing that problem, and then how best to optimize humans and automation. So we'll touch on that in a second. The other question that was asked is, would you like to elaborate, as someone who has seen or studied past cycles of tectonic changes, how is this change different, except for the fact that this is at a much faster rate? That's a great question, and it's one of the reasons why we went back to the second and third industrial revolutions to take a look at how work has evolved. I think the big changes that we're seeing are the following. The first is certainly, as Manohar has asked, that the pace of change is much greater. We're seeing and this is happening as a result of multiple technologies not operating independently as we saw in the second industrial revolution with, for example, the internal combustion engine and the light bulb. Rather, with multiple technologies converging on each other and acting as accelerants for each other. I think that's a key part of it. The second key variable is also the rapid pace of adoption. Our ability to disseminate technology and increase adoption orders of magnitude greater than we've had in the past, and that's being enabled by cloud-based computing, by mobile and wireless communication, et cetera. And then I think that the third variable here is the resulting impact on the democratization of work, where we are finding opportunities for work to be done through arrangements, as you heard from John and me in the early slides, being done through means that have far less frictional cost than the traditional construct of work being done by an employee in a job. John,
can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Great.
Did you want to this first question about companies?
Well, I think on the one hand, I think we can tie it in, and it'll also, these are terrific questions. Thanks to everyone, and I think it'll tie in as we move forward as well. So I think if you started with the question of how are companies rewarding employees other than in traditional ways, and you combine that with this idea of even inside companies, we saw examples in Lead the Work of companies that were creating more project-based work. So probably my favorite example, and one that's very prominent in that book, was one that Diane Gerson, the head of HR at IBM, provided. And this is now really kind of ubiquitous across a lot of organizations. But you see a lot of these models where organizations have said, look, we may not be ready yet to reach outside of our organization to this very democratic, very widespread talent pool. It may not be necessary all the time, or our general counsel may not be comfortable with it yet. So often what they're doing is they're saying, we'll create a platform for our employees, that they're already under employment contract, they already exist inside the boundary, we don't have to mess with our organization boundary, but we could adjust the other dimensions. So with IBM, if you're a leader in their professional services and you come and say, I have a business plan and I need these job requisitions filled, IBM HR will say, hold on a moment, let's step back and let's ask ourselves, what is the work involved in those jobs, and could we take it apart? And could it become tasks that could be put out as projects? Then let's present to you this platform we've created with IBM's Watson, creating a perpetual language of the work based on the transactions people are undertaking. So employees at IBM can volunteer for tasks that help out other units at IBM. They're already getting paid. They're already getting their benefits. Why would they do that? Well, it turns out they do it for a number of rather non-traditional reasons. To get exposure to a group they might not get exposure to through their regular job because maybe they want to work there in the future. To work on a project they strongly believe in and has a sense of purpose for them, maybe a health project or an environmental project where they might not get to work on that in their normal work. To show off and showcase and get badges that verify certain skills and capabilities that they have, but that are not necessarily a part of their formal current job description. And we've seen similar examples of this kind of thing at Disney, which talked about engaging the whole person and creating platforms that would allow people to make known and showcase the skills that they have over and above the traditional rewards that they had. So again, these are not necessary for every kind of work, but they will be either necessary or very helpful in certain kinds of work. And so another question here is, what do chief HR officers, CEOs, et cetera, need to gear up for? I think what we're seeing here is you need to gear up for a world in which some of the fundamental concepts we have about work begin to, they begin to be challenged, that work is contained in a job, that the work that someone does is contained in this thing we pay them for, that the workers we engage are going to be inside our organization. All of those things have, once you blow them up, they have fundamental implications. We'll talk about it in terms of leadership, in terms of HR. What does turnover mean if it's just a break in someone's employment and they're going to come back? What does leadership mean if you need to think about whether you're a leader to the contract workers that work for you in addition to the employees, and should we be doing an engagement survey on contract workers when they're a significant proportion of our workers? So that's kind of the sorts of questions that when Ravin and David Creelman and I began were fascinating to us when we wrote Lead the Work. And I think, as Ravin said, the confluence of technology, social change, the emergence of social networks, all of those things are happening at once. And what they do is they come together in a way that creates, as the group of thought leaders I worked with for a couple of years, the CREATE group said, there's a big dimension of the democratization of work, power flowing to the worker, voice flowing to the worker, workers in charge of their career, in charge of their development, and then on the other dimension, an increase in technological sophistication. the idea of an Amazon or Google-like experience at work that parallels the Amazon and Google experience we have when we purchase projects, the idea of constant data flowing in about employees, et cetera. So I think in answer to the question, that's why for us this feels as if it is more than just the same thing as a prior tectonic change. Yes, it's faster, but it's also more fundamental, and it's also across much greater number of dimensions.
John, did you want to talk to our framework on this slide?
Yeah, I will, and then, you know, I know for those of you that provide questions, we're keeping an eye on them, and we'll try and, you know, move to them as well as we go through. So thank you very much. We'll keep watching there and try to get to as many of them as we can. So as Ravin said, let me just touch on this slide, which is kind of the summary framework of the new book that's coming out in October, and that will be a significant topic for discussion and exercises and peer learning when we meet in Plano, Texas, near Dallas in October for the Future of Work Symposium. So in a nutshell, we've talked about a number of these dimensions. The idea, first of all, is that the work you're automating, if we look at that top left rectangle, the work you're automating will almost certainly need to be what we call deconstructed. That means that you simply can't see the patterns, and you can't do what you need to do if you let the work stay trapped in a job. It is almost never, will a robot replace this human in a job? Will a chatbot replace this call center worker? Almost never. And in fact, the research on this has had to move from asking those questions to breaking the work out into its subunits, usually tasks, and asking how automation compatible are the tasks and what's the rate of automation likely to be. So that's the first step there. Step one is deconstruct the work, and then step one is how compatible with automation is it? We've given you 3 dimensions there that you can read about in the book and hear about in our session in Texas. The graph to the right there, step 2, has to do with something you're all familiar with if you've read my work, that has to do with the nature of the return on improved performance. Are we automating something where the big payoff is reducing mistakes? Let's say that's the left side, getting rid of really low performance, if performance is low on the left and high on the right, and return is vertical. It's very different from automating a situation where you're going to improve the existing performance of people. And that in turn is very different from the right-hand side, where you have very, very high performance that creates an exponential return. And very often, those returns are not even available except with automation. As Ravin said, you see a number of instances where the skill premium to workers is actually going up once the job is automated. That often speaks to something on the right-hand side of that curve, where automation has made it possible for all the humans doing the work to be significantly of greater value, often doing the work in a very different way than they did before. So those 2 dimensions, you break the work down, and then for each task you look at compatibility, you look at its return, and then finally at the bottom 2 rectangle, the 2 final steps are consider the type of automation, and Ravin talked about that with you in an earlier slide. Is it going to be robotic process automation? Is it something more cognitive like artificial intelligence? Or is it something more social, where the automation, usually a robot, will actually interact physically with people? And then finally, step 4 is, what is the automation going to do? Will it substitute for humans? Again, it's not that doesn't happen, but it's not the only thing that happens. Will it augment the human workers, essentially making them better at similar work that they've done before? Or does it literally transform the work to a point where the human automation combination is a completely different thing than we saw before? And then we have some examples over on the right. So again, there'll be more on this. Ravin and I have begun to write about it in blogs, and you can find that on our website. And as the book comes out in October, this framework is developed with examples, et cetera. And then in addition, it's also relevant to the session we'll be running in Plano in early October.
Great, thank you. Some of the work design implications of the framework that John just talked about. Now, just touch on a couple of these as we go through. As you apply automation, we've seen some interesting opportunities to fundamentally rethink the work. where is the work done? So we've seen work that might have been done traditionally in a retail setting where it's done on site at the particular location, the opportunity to consolidate that work and move it off site. Work that may have been done by dedicated teams in specific locations like maintenance, being done now by shared services teams because we've deployed sensors and AI that allow us to be more proactive in predicting and then responding to maintenance issues. Work that may have been done maybe primarily cognitive in nature, and that call center example, and which is now being machine augmented. And so the thing that we've seen, and which hopefully if you do buy the book, you'll see in the many, many examples we have there, is the application of automation as a result of the reinvention of jobs is a fundamental game changer and raises opportunities and options that I think could never have been envisioned prior to the application or the opportunities from automation. Some of the output, I talked about how we've seen organizations successfully do this as a result of experimenting with a workflow or looking at a particular set of jobs. And the impact of automation often is something that you see on this slide. Looking at the various activities that make up that workflow or that job, looking at how the activities have changed as a result of the application or redeployment of work to AI and robotics, where in some cases activities are shifted to other roles, activities that might have been done on oil rigs being shifted to centralized control rooms. In other cases, they're augmented by automation, as John talked about. In other cases where they're eliminated by the automation. And then yet new activities created as a result of automation being deployed. The work of data scientists to be able to sort of synthesize and analyze the data that's being generated from the many sensors and AI on different pieces of equipment. The work of robot maintenance experts who now have to be deployed to maintain the many robots that are being deployed on manufacturing facilities. So a fundamental transformation here of how work is being done. And with that, all of those things that HR has traditionally been concerned about as it relates to culture, as it relates to how we organize jobs, as it relates to how we deploy talent, all of those things then realize a step change. And with those changes, we also identified some of the changing requirements of leaders as a result of this transformation of work. John, did you want to talk to a couple of these?
Thanks, Ravin. And I'm hoping some of this, we've had a number of questions about the nature of learning and how learning will be carried out and what this means for workers. And I think that I think a general answer will be that there will undoubtedly be different ways of learning, and this will put a good deal of innovation pressure on whatever is the learning organization or the learning unit in your organizations. I think also we're going to see a rapid acceleration of something that's been happening for a long time, which is putting the power of learning out to the learners, out to the people doing the job, and out to the mentor and development relationship that workers have with, let's call it, their supervisors. And so as you look at how leaders are going to need to think differently about this, if you look on the left side, we have a fairly traditional role. We organize a hierarchy and we fill jobs. Our people are going to learn something and then do it and then retire. We have qualifications for this thing called employment and an employment contract. We attach salaries to intact jobs. We have a job architecture. The work is contained in jobs, and it's the structure of the jobs that tell us how people are developing, where they're moving, et cetera. You learn for the next job, et cetera, and that leads to traditional career ladders, but even lattices that are defined in terms of a set of jobs and movement laterally or upward in terms of jobs. So that's the left side on the from side. What we see, and again, this is the future is unevenly distributed. What we're not saying is that this is an eye blink that's going to happen tomorrow, or that every kind of work in your organization needs to make this transition. However, an increasing amount of the work, an increasing amount of the job of your leaders is going to mean they'll have to think in terms of deconstructed parts. That's the first row. not in terms of fixed jobs. They'll have to be comfortable saying, I know I need this work done, but it's not as easy as getting a requisition filled. I need to break it apart, and I need to think about how each part of it might be best done, and where I could find the people that are prepared to learn or prepared to join us to do the work. A mindset that isn't so much learn something, do it for a career, and then retire, but something that is learn, do, rest, learn, do, rest. So a continuous pattern of learning that may happen inside or outside the organization. Again, let's think about the implications in the questions a lot of you have answered. How will people develop? How will we deal with the disconnects and the disruption that happens? And I think one of that is that leaders need to be expected to have a constant conversation. That this encompasses, but is beyond just performance management. Yes, performance management conversations ought to be more developmental. They ought to be more constant. And Ed and Jerry Ledford and others have done a lot of recent work on that. But there's also something more fundamental. There should be a constant conversation about the acceptance that skills are becoming obsolete every day. The acceptance that this learn, do, rest is the way we're going to do business here. So it's up to leaders to raise the issue when technology appears on the horizon, like a chatbot or a robot that can flip hamburgers or a robot that can juggle an ice cube. Those are fine little stories that most leaders ignore until it's necessary to tell people they're being replaced or their job has changed. We suggest that that should be a constant conversation, that as soon as you see the technology, your leaders need to be good at having a conversation with people about how that might affect them. So as you go down, instead of employment qualifications, we look at individuals' work readiness, whether it's badges, whether it's what they've done before, et cetera. We less set salaries for jobs, and we begin pricing the activities themselves. And we put them all together. Some of them done by automation, some of them done by contractors, some of them done by people who are called employees. And we set the price of the work in that more combined way, aggregating all kinds of different things. So I'm hoping this slide is just the beginning of a conversation that offers some answers to some of what some of you were asking about. How will leadership change? What do leaders need to gear up for? How will learning change in the organization? I don't know that I can say how learning will be delivered, but I think we can safely say it's going to be delivered by a broader mix than certainly traditional classroom, and probably encompassing more learning by doing that involves moving in and out of the organization boundaries to that idea of reskilling pathways rather than something we call careers that move through jobs at the bottom. Robin might go ahead and advance to the next one, and we'll, I think, hopefully continue to answer some of the questions here. For leaders, it's about orchestrating an ecosystem. In other words, it's not as easy now to say we lead the work that's contained in jobs in our organization. You basically have to lead the work that is contained in an ecosystem of things like contractors, volunteers, gig workers, and also be willing to optimize that work even with your employees across your business model. So how do we combine these things? How do we optimize these things? This is a great opportunity for HR to begin to develop the models to do that. For managers, it's really coordination of alternative options, not just managing the jobs, but coordinating these different kinds of employment and work options, including automation and different employment arrangements. And then for HR, yes, there is this curation of experiences, and those experiences, so yes, HR will be kind of in charge of the, call it the work experience, but that experience is now going to happen through a whole set of new arrangements. And HR, we think, will begin to need to look at all types of talent, not just talent that is defined as people who have obtained this thing that we call a job. So if we move ahead, and then Ravin, I'll kind of finish rather quickly here since we have time. I'm going to tell you what's on the slides and you'll see them. The Centaur chess one is really just an example to illustrate this. It turns out there's a new kind of chess where one player brings artificial intelligence that they've chosen to the table, and so does another human player. And it turns out that the chess players that are good at this new kind of chess are the ones that learn how to work with artificial intelligence. They let it make decisions when it should, and they step in and override it when they should. And that's very different from being just a plain human chess master or developing good AI to play chess. And then the next slide is really just one of my favorite examples of this idea of perpetual upgrading. Your phone gets upgraded every day, and then there comes a moment where you have to get a new phone because it's moved so far that old things like headphone jacks don't work anymore. That, to me, is exactly the metaphor we have at work, and it's relevant to leaders, to HR, and to workers. Every day, the work that someone does is changing to be done maybe better by automation, to be done better by a person with a different arrangement, et cetera. That means that we need not just to say, how do we develop people for the future work, but that development needs to be something that's happening all the time, and these conversations need to be happening all the time. Which leads us to just remind you that one source of these ideas is the book that Ravin and I will see published by Harvard in early October called Reinventing Jobs. And then finally, to remind you that our next venue for inviting you to join us, to join our speakers who are going to help us discuss these issues, give you an opportunity to learn, to apply some of this to your own work, et cetera, takes place, as you can see here, in Plano, Texas, on October 4th. We'll be joined, Ravin and me, will be joined by Terry Griffith, an affiliate of the center who's done a great deal of work on changing work arrangements. Some of you asked, how are workers to be made more resilient? What is the research on how workers are coping with this? Terry is an expert on that. Julie Wood, Chief People Officer at Crow Horwath LLP, will join us, and Scott Smith, Senior VP of HR Operations at AT&T, with conversations with Ravin. And then some of you asked about Amazon's experiments with automation and 30-hour work weeks, et cetera. I'm delighted to say that Scott Bataski, my good friend and colleague, who is now Vice President of HR for Consumer at Amazon, will also be joining us in the session in Texas in October. So hopefully mark your calendars. We still have some space left, and notice at the bottom of this slide that there's a discount code that you can use when you enroll to get a 15% discount off the fees for the program. With that, I think we've reached the end of the hour. Gina, perhaps I'll turn it back to you, and Ravin maybe just advance to the final slide, and we'll conclude. Thank you all for questions as well.
Yes, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, John, and thank you, Ravin. Great to have you as always. And stay tuned, look out for the email that we will send that has information on how you can register with that discount, as well as a link to the slides and the recording of this webinar. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day.
Thank you, Ravin. Thanks, everyone.